So welcome everybody. Good evening. My name is Gail Kurtzman, and on behalf of Beth Tikva Synagogue and the Adult Education Committee, I would like to welcome our special guest, Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. And just a reminder that this program is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, please turn off your video. And as usual, if you have questions, please direct them in the chat to myself or Rabbi Grover, and we'll aim to answer them at the end of the program. And now I'd like to hand it over to Rabbi Grover.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Gail. So just as Gail said, this conversation with Rabbi Hirsch is going to begin with just an exchange between the two of us. But I know that among those joining us tonight, there are some big Rabbi Hirsch fans. I know that because every Sunday or so, I get an email saying, you got to check out what Rabbi Hirsch said in his sermon and let me know your thoughts. So you're one of the benefits of the world we live in now, Rabbi, is that our congregants get to travel to New York and way beyond to get a taste of different rabbis and hear different opinions. And I think Stephen Wise has done actually a wonderful job at, I've been following what Stephen Wise has been doing in terms of strengthening their online presence. And you should be really proud of what your team has done there, because I think it's exposed the Jewish world to you, who is a deeply admired and important thinker, I think, in today's Jewish conversation. So those who are joining us tonight, who I know might have a question or two about the topics that we're going to cover, just as Gail said, feel free to write your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the conversation. Give me a thumbs up can everyone give me a thumbs up if they heard what I said? Okay, sometimes I don't know who I'm talking to. Let me introduce tonight's guest for those who don't know. He thought that we were having him as part of a series. Rabbi, this is not a series. You're the only one that we want to hear from, specially selected from members of our Adult Education Committee, because as I said to you last week, I think this is a congregation, Beth Tikva in Toronto, to whom you speak with particular resonance. You have been the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City, where you have led a dramatic revival in Jewish life since arriving there in 2004. In 2018, the Jerusalem Post named you among the 50 most influential Jews of the year. Prior to your arrival at Stephen Wise, you served for 12 years as Executive Director of the Association of Reform Zionists of America, ARTSA, the Israel arm of the North American Reform Movement. Rabbi Hirsch has served on numerous boards of national and international bodies, including the Jewish Agency for Israel, the World Zionist Organization, the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He is currently an officer of the New York Board of Rabbis and a member of the Partnership of Faith, an interfaith body of New York religious leaders, and New York State Attorney General Letitia James Black Jewish Clergy Roundtable. An accomplished teacher, writer, and public speaker, Rabbi Hirsch received his LLB from the London School of Economics and has also served as a tank commander in the Israeli Defense Force. Rabbi Hirsch, welcome virtually to Beth Tikva Synagogue in Toronto. So this has been an interesting and challenging year for you. Before I say anything else, I want to wish you condolences on behalf of all of us at Beth Tikva on the loss of your father. I read your biography, but maybe you could tell us just before we begin a little bit about your father. Our congregation may not know what a major leader he was in the Reform movement.
Well, first of all, Rabbi Grover, it is very good to be with you, with our Canadian friends. We're kindred spirits. We believe in many of the same things. I was telling Rabbi Grover, you'll remember last week that I mentioned to you that I almost ended up in Toronto. I did receive an offer from Holy Blossom right after I finished rabbinical school. And because of family reasons, I never got there, but my life could have completely changed. And we could have been neighbors had that worked out. And I want to thank the members of the committee who put this together. And especially if you follow some of the things we do via our website or streaming, I appreciate that very much. And stay in touch with me. Let me know what you think. And don't hesitate to point out where you think I've gone wrong too. That's part of the Jewish experience.
That does not apply to me. I only want positive, but you criticize Rabbi Hirsch, I guess.
And I really very much appreciate your kind words about my father. It's still, his loss is still raw for us. He passed away 2 months ago. And he was, of course, a great father, and my mother, of blessed memory, were beautiful together. They had a very long marriage. They produced 4 kids, 11 grandchildren, 6 great grandchildren. And so it was really a privileged and blessed family life that we had. For the Jewish community, I think that my father not only participated in, but largely generated 2 of the 2 key initiatives and decisions of the North American reform movement of the 20th century, from the middle of the 20th century to the end of the century. The first was, he was the founding director of what's known as the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. Are you familiar with that? It's our lobbying arm of the movement, and with it was controversial at the time. It was established in 1962. He was the founding director, and the reason it was controversial is because there was a lot of opposition of a religious institution setting up shop in Washington, D.C., and being engaged and involved in the policy issues of the day. But the view that propounded that this is one of the key roles of religion, to try and better the world, make the world a better place through, among other ways, influencing policies, national policies, that view prevailed, and it has become mainstream and very powerful in the reform movement now. And so in effect, the establishment of the Religious Action Center, with my father as the founding director and its chief advocate, set the agenda of the North American reform movement on social justice ever since, for the last half century. Even more consequential, in my opinion, was in 1973, he became the executive director, the executive head of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which is the international arm of the reform movement. We have synagogues in dozens of countries around the world. And my father, who was always a Zionist from the very beginning, even when it was very difficult to be a Zionist in the reform movement, he was the first student at the rabbinical seminary to study in Israel, contrary to the will of most of the faculty that suggested that it would be harmful for his career if he did that. He moved the international headquarters of the reform movement to Jerusalem, because he felt that Israel is the heart of the Jewish world, and that any movement that cannot be influential in Israel, can't grow in Israel and become central to the Israeli identity. Any movement that can't do that, that is simply a diaspora movement, will eventually become marginalized and wither away from the Jewish historical experience,
Hmm.
because he felt that Israel, and he wrote this already in 1969, it was highly controversial. But I remember we took a sabbatical year in '69 in Israel, and he wrote a very famous piece in the Jerusalem Post where he characterized Israel as Broadway and the diaspora as off Broadway. And he felt very strongly that if we were not on Broadway, we would become marginalized.
Fascinating. So listening to some of what you speak about today, it seems that you're very much following ideologically in your father's path.
You know, in his later years, we would speak every day, and he was already getting more advanced in years, and so in many respects, he found solace in my speaking and my views, and of course, like all very successful and public people, he had very high standards, and so did my mother, and so they had very high standards of us, and since we ended up in the same business, he let me know when he felt I fell short. But in his later years, he either mellowed or I became more proficient because he could hardly bring himself to criticize me.
So for you, but what about for the movement that he was once the celebrated leader of? He created the RAC. The RAC's changed a lot. That's the Reform Religious Action Center. His positions on Israel, which you might say were once mainstream in the Reform movement, the centrality of Israel to the Jewish experience, for some in the Reform movement today, and perhaps even a growing number, that's no longer the case. Did your father? You can tell me if I shouldn't be asking this question, but I'm genuinely curious to know if he ever opened up to you about what's happened to his legacy.
Well, of course. I mean, we spoke about everything, including our perspective on and how well colleagues were doing and what they were thinking. First of all, he was very secure in his legacy because what started as 2 or 3 reform institutions in Israel became dozens and dozens of synagogues. One of the highlights of his career that he felt justified much of what he did was we established 2 reform kibbutzim on the way down to Eilat. So what's known in our movement as the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, and the World Union for Progressive Judaism are well established in Israel and have developed by significant leaps since the early 70s when he moved the international headquarters.
But what about America?
Well, so we spoke a lot about this, and both in terms of our movement's approach to Zionism, as well as its movement, its perspective on social action, religious action, social justice, which he always felt was connected, and I do too. In fact, he wrote a book called "From the Hill to the Mount," i.e., from Capitol Hill to Mount Zion. And he made the case that, in his view, this was simply an extension. The Jerusalem experience was an extension of his ideology that brought him to Capitol Hill, which was the fight for Jewish self-determination was among the highest social justice causes for not only for Jews, but for humanity itself. So that was always, in terms of stated beliefs, the reform movement came to embrace that perspective. But in terms of practice and in terms of the strength of the commitment in the past in the past decade or decade and a half, that has become questionable. And that's one of the things that I speak about all the time, because I don't want the reform movement to weaken its connection with what we call in Jewish theological terms, Klal Yisrael, the centrality of the Jewish people. Because in the absence of the centrality of the Jewish people, all movements in Judaism in the past and in the future that distance themselves from the centrality of the Jewish people, both in ideology as well as in practice, become irrelevant. And so it's a matter of high concern for me that the reform movement not do that. And that's becoming more and more difficult for many reasons, which I'm happy to explore.
That's what I'd like to talk about. So what is at the root of that distancing? What is it? Is it still Netanyahu or Netanyahu's legacy? Is it changing attitudes of American Jewry? Is it two different conceptions of what Judaism is?
I think it's all of that, and happy to delineate and detail that. But fundamentally, I think it starts with values and ideology. I think most of our actions in life follow our beliefs most of the time. It dawned on me about 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, that what I always thought, I headed the Reform Zionist efforts in North America, which included Canada, by the way. I always felt that the anti-Zionism of the 19th to mid-20th century Reform movement was a thing of the past. Mm-hmm. We had created a Zionist arm. I was its chair. I was its senior executive. We passed all kinds of platforms that expressed our strong Zionist commitment. We raised money and other resources for the development of the Israel movement. And so when you went back in history and read all of the anti-Zionist material and understood the passion of the Zionism of at least 2 generations of Reform rabbis in North America, then my impression was, well, okay, this was a phase in history, and it's gone and it won't return. Mm-hmm. But what I discovered, what I concluded, was that original founding position of the Reform movement that brought it,
which is that Judaism is a religion rather than a nationality, right? This distancing from the concept of the Jewish people and focusing more on the idea of redeeming the world.
Right. This tension between what we call universalism and particularism. Which was always a healthy tension in Judaism.
Yes.
Both are present. And one without the other causes an imbalance in Judaism. But the truly revolutionary part of what we call classical Reform Judaism, as I say, in the end of the 19th to the mid-20th century, was their statement, even before Theodor Herzl wrote The Jewish State, their statement, as Rabbi Grover mentioned, that we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community. And hence, we do not expect, nor will we work towards the redemption of Zion. And that led them to discount Hebrew and to discount the ritual garb and to discount anything that smacked of Jewish peoplehood. Mm-hmm. And then that was already well established by the 1880s. And so 10 to 15 years later, when Zionism came onto the scene, the Reform movement's position was already well established. We no longer consider ourselves a people, but a religious community. And so even though Herzl propounded an ideology that was entirely secular, nonetheless, at its core, it put the concept of Jewish peoplehood at the center. It was all about the redemption of what we call in religion, the redemption of the Jewish people, self-determination. And so the pre-existing religious position of Reform Judaism naturally led to not only a dismissal of the Zionism that Herzl was ushering into the world, but a passionate opposition, almost a loathing of Zionism, because it violated the fundamental religious revolution of the Reform movement, that we consider ourselves no longer a people. And that position lasted until basically the creation of the state of Israel.
Or some would say until the Shoah, when the Shoah awakened the Jewish community to the price that it paid by abandoning peoplehood.
Well,
and
not
even the most assimilated of Reform Jews might say, we screwed up. We left our people alone and vulnerable in Europe and did nothing to save them.
Yes, for sure. But even here, there was a deeper ideological verdict against classical reform. And it was a stunning verdict. This movement that had placed its hopes, almost messianic hopes, on, and when we spoke about that, on European rationalism, on Kantian ethics, right? On German philosophy.
Right.
It was the Germans themselves that perpetrated history's most evil deed.
Yeah, the wokes of the 19th century.
Yeah. And so it was clear how bankrupt that classical reform philosophy really was. And then with the creation of the Jewish state, the issues more or less became moot because the state was created already. I must add one additional thing, Rabbi, and that is some of the greatest Zionist leaders of the 20th century were Reform rabbis who rebelled against the Reform movement position of the time. And one of
Stephen
them,
Wise.
Exactly. One of them is the
one of the greatest
Rabbi
American Zionist leaders.
The other one, maybe some of your folks have heard of Abigail Silver, who represented Israel at the United Nations debate.
Right. So you thought that was history. You thought it was left behind. And today you see a resurgence of that peopleless Judaism, emphasizing its religious, emphasizing religious doctrine and tikkun olam, and dropping the emphasis on peoplehood.
Right, I do.
Yeah, I grew up in the Reform movement, and I started seeing it too, but in a different way than I think you saw it. One of the reasons I left the Reform movement is because I saw, I guess, the abandonment of the Jewish peoplehood in the radical embracing of intermarriage and everybody and everything. This emphasis on welcoming without emphasis on principle. And you could see it in the congregations. The de-emphasis on Hebrew, for instance, on traditional liturgy, for instance. But you see it today more in the approach of the Reform movement, or some in the Reform movement towards Israel. For those of us who don't know about this, can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing?
So what has happened, what dawned on me was actually, it wasn't that this position was relegated to the ash heap of history. It was that the experiences of the Jewish people in the 20th century were the exception to that compelled the Reform movement back into the Jewish peoplehood embrace. We had already at the beginning of the century, we had pogroms. Then we had the rise of fascism. We had the Holocaust, of course. We had the struggle for the Jewish state. And to a certain degree, we had the struggle for Soviet Jewry.
Yes.
The 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. And so, but by the 1980s, these existential threats against Israel were perceived by Jews in the West as having diminished. And in fact, if anything, Israel increasingly became viewed as the strongest party in the Middle East, even though it's still surrounded by 300 to 400 million Arabs, most of whom, and Muslims, most of whom are still enemies. But nonetheless, 2 generations at least of American Jews, most of whom are liberal, came to view Israel in a different way and no longer were experiencing the kind of existential crises and existential threats that the Jewish people faced throughout the 20th century. And so, freed from that really very powerful dynamic that pushed liberal American Jews into the embrace of Jewish peoplehood, really what I came to realize was that the natural default position of Jewish liberalism is a preponderance of emphasis on the universal aspect of Judaism, not as an expression of the particular, but at the expense of Jewish peoplehood. Mm-hmm. And that's why, in my view, very few of rabbis and leaders of, people in official positions would say that they're anti-Zionist or not Zionist. They would say that they're Zionist. But what they speak about and what they emphasize reveals that they tilt too much on the universal side,
and what they don't speak about, which is a point you've made before, not just what they say, but when they choose not to say something, which is I think today maybe even the bigger crisis. The official institutions which have to balance the different voices sometimes choose not to speak, and you see more in that silence than in words that could be spoken.
Well, I'll give you a good example.
Yeah.
I don't know, did you follow in Canada the women's marches in the United States?
We know about them, yeah.
So this was in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump. There was great concern in the liberal community across the board, including the Jewish community. We shared it, and there were a series of marches, and increasingly they were led by downright opponents of Israel and of Zionists, anti-Zionist BDS people, and people who swore allegiance
Linda
to
Sarsour and her
Sarsour, Louis Farrakhan, people who swore allegiance to Louis Farrakhan. And after 2 years of this, in preparation, I think it was for the 3rd year, I began pondering, why are we lending our support to these people who deny the legitimacy of the Jewish state and even the Jewish people, by the way, which I hope we can speak about at some point, as an aspect of the anti-Jewish approach of some very left-wing progressives. And so I began to raise this issue, and I said, why should we march with them? Not that we shouldn't march, but why should we march with? It was called Women's March Inc., I think it was called, which was led by Linda Sarsour and a number of other people who were hostile to Israel, and were active in the boycott. And so I contacted the very religious action center that my father led. And I asked them what our position is.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we have no position.
Mm-hmm.
To which my response is, these are anti-Semites. You have no position on whether we should be marching with anti-Semites, with people who are against Israel? And they, you know, and it was clear to me that it was mixed up.
Right.
The issue of Israel is mixed up with a growing hostility on the left to Israel, and they concluded that if they wanted to be part of this progressive world, they couldn't alienate our movement to such a degree that we would pull out entirely.
Right.
But with respect to them, I think that's a wrong position. And
you took a public stance, right, against, and you took a lot of heat for that.
We were the only synagogue that was willing to take a public stance. We pulled out. We announced that we were pulling out. Mm-hmm. And a year later, the whole thing withered away anyway.
Right. Is part of this that the emphasis in modern Reform Judaism has this social justice bent, always siding with the victim, finding the little guy. And I was raised with that. You look out for the victim, whether it's the civil rights movement in my father's generation or in my generation, refugees and the like. And what is the Torah? The Torah is the book that calls us out to look after the orphan, the widow, etc. And then this intersectionality with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and saying, I don't feel comfortable siding. I don't know how to side with the one who has power, because all I've been taught is that we have to side with the victim, and the world is telling me, and the media is telling me, that it's the Palestinians who are the victims. So my practice of Judaism compels me to side with Palestinians. Is part of that, I know I don't want you to criticize, the Reform movement and its and what it chooses to emphasize, but does that resonate with you at all?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize and clarify. I'm a liberal. I don't define myself as anything but liberal, and it's one of the reasons I'm a Zionist, because I think Zionism is a liberal cause. It's about self-determination, and I also believe that to the extent that liberalism has special concern for the weak of society, for the poor, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, that it's the public's responsibility to lift up the fallen. To the extent that that's a liberal position, I believe that Judaism is liberalism in that respect. My criticism of the hard left is that I don't think they're liberal. I think the mindset is an intolerant mindset. This idea of there's one position, and either you agree with me, or by definition, you're mistaken, immoral, racist. That actually is not liberalism, which believes in free discussion, in carving out as much space in society for debate, because liberals believe that the best way to advance towards truth is through a free exchange of ideas in the public square. So to the extent that this new approach, which seeks to stigmatize anybody who disagrees with me, and morality is what I say it is actually not not liberal. And so that is of great concern to me, because what we know for sure from our history is that any straying from the liberal order is eventually always bad for Jews.
Mm. Tell me what you mean by that.
What has made the American experience so beneficial for the Jews, the Jewish community, is its liberal values. Live and let live, the autonomy of the individual, free press, free exchange.
I was just talking about this to someone, that the Jew always becomes the other in an illiberal society.
Always, always. And you can see that in some of these elements in the progressive left, who seek to otherwise opponents who disagree with them, for example, on questions of race or the economy. And Jews are always going to be on the other side.
Right. I want to ask you a question from the other perspective, out of genuine curiosity for how you handle this challenge, which I face as well in the pulpit. When you speak principally about Israel, sometimes the more progressive crowd might come to me afterwards and say, there is no place for me in the Zionist discussion. That is, it's almost the opposite of what you're saying, that we talk about Zionism as if we can handle nuance, but in practice, when someone comes in and wants to talk about oppression and wants to talk about apartheid and wants to talk about occupation, they are instantly pushed away from the discussion and there's no room for them. How do you answer those challenges, which I'm sure have come your way?
First of all, we embrace that. We embrace not only diversity, we embrace argumentation. The Mishnah states, every argument that is for the sake of heaven, machloket l'shem shamayim, by which I understand they mean to get closer to truth, for authentic, sincere purposes, is blessed, is destined to endure. So we need to be able to welcome diverse opinions, the diverse Jewish community, and I say we make space for that in our congregation, and I say, yeah, come on, join the crowd.
Do you think the American Zionist community, beyond the walls of Stephen Wise, do you think the American Zionist discussion makes sufficient room for critical voices, or is it perpetuating the very problem that you're describing, right, from the other side, by not making room for more critical voices?
I don't see a lack of public space for multiple voices on Israel, almost covering the whole spectrum of opinions. I don't see that. I see in the United States Zionist groups that define themselves as liberal or left-wing. There are many of them, and they're very popular. I see quite a few Zionist organizations that define themselves as right-wing. So I don't see it. I have heard the argument of people who feel that what they characterize as the Jewish establishment suppresses debate. And that might be true on a very narrow basis. I don't know what goes on in each.
This came up when J Space was kicked out of the president's organization.
Yeah, it's called J Street here, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so they might look. I was when I was at ARTA, I was on the Conference of Presidents of the full name
Council of
the
Presidents
organization
of major Jewish organizations.
of major American Jewish organizations. And the truth of the matter is there were something like 52 or 54 organizations there, 10 of which were major Jewish American organizations and 44 were minor American Jewish organizations. But, you know, no organization wants to call itself the Conference of Presidents of 10 major American Jewish organizations and all the rest of them. So, but there's a lot of internal, as we have in our synagogues and in any organization, there's a lot of internal political dynamics. And I don't really know what that turned on, but the marketplace of ideas, the publicity, the place where ideas are formed, where values are introduced into the Jewish community and into American society is not in any one of these organizations. It's in the public square. And I don't see any evidence that one side or another of the Zionist spectrum is mistreated. I don't see it.
So let's talk a bit about Jewish peoplehood just before we end. I think we have to devote some time to what you mean when you say the future of Judaism hinges on a commitment to Jewish peoplehood. This is something that you said was a firm belief of your late fathers, just as it's a firm belief that you hold. And yet you also say that the 20th century was unique, and maybe our commitment to Jewish peoplehood as a reform movement only came about because of the circumstances of the time. And now we're going to revert back to who we were originally, a movement destined to emphasize Judaism as a religion. So you are a kol koreh bamidbar, a little bit on that issue. Why do you feel that, why are you so insistent that reform not abandon the principles that it that it adopted in your father's day?
So I think Jewish peoplehood is the heart of Judaism. We're reading through in the Parsha of the week. We're reading through the Abraham stories. Last week we read through Lech Lecha at the very outset of Judaism. God says to Abraham, the founder of the new nation, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. And so from the very beginning of Judaism, the two central principles that have accompanied us for the last 3,000 years were established immediately in the first 8 verses of the first chapter that deals with the Jews. The first 11 chapters of Genesis is prehistory or pre-Jewish history. And that is what we call today nationhood. Es halagoy gadol, I will make of you a great nation. And I have given you this land. Nationhood and national territory are the foundational principles of Judaism from its very origins. We see here, by the way, also.
But
right
Christianity abandoned those principles, and they're doing fine.
Right. So that, apropos Abba Hillel Silver, that was Abba Hillel Silver's main critique in the 1930s of the anti-Zionist Reform rabbis. He said exactly what you said, Rabbi Grover, that the last mainstream Jewish force that rejected Jewish peoplehood were Pauline Christianity.
Right.
And he predicted that if the reform movement didn't come back to Jewish peoplehood, that the same thing would happen to it. But as I said,
that is, it would become a separate religion.
Eventually, it would be marginalized and disappear. I don't know if it would become a central religion, because, as you say, there are religions. Christianity is a universal religion, and what we are seeing from the parts of the Jewish community that don't feel a strong ideological or practical connection with Judaism there's a significant assimilation as well. So it's not necessarily the creation of a new religion, but it's just the withering away from Judaism of that element. And I firmly believe that it's inconsistent with Judaism. By the way, as in that very passage in Genesis, we also have the enshrinement, the rooting of this tension between what we now call Jewish particularism and Jewish universalism. I will make of you a great nation, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. In other words, the purpose of the existence of this nation is not self-aggrandizement, it's not ego, it's not conquest. It's to bring blessing to the world entire, what we call today tikkun olam.
Why is it so difficult, given how clear that principle is in the Torah? Why is it so difficult for young Jews, particularly in the United States, to get that message? I believe that it not only has tremendous consequences for future support for the state of Israel, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The belief in Jewish peoplehood is about Jewish family, about Jewish marriage, about Jewish continuity. The family unit can't be replaced so easily by live stream and other vehicles that we hope to place our trust in to perpetuate Judaism into the future. So why is it so hard to get that message across? What's not working, and what might we do more effectively to get that message across, that being nationalist is not being racist?
Yeah, well, it's hard because it kind of cuts against increasingly the gestalt, the mindset of the 21st century, right? The mindset of the flow of history in the West is a move away from religion, away from what's called ethnicity, away from nationalism, to a more universal understanding of the flow of history and of the human condition. So we grew up and are part of that mindset, which is accelerating in the 21st century. If you don't live in a Jewish state, then you don't glean the spirit of the collectivity. It's not natural. If you're living in Israel, no matter whether you define yourself as religious or not religious, atheist, secular, chiloni, which is not exactly secular, but you can't help but glean the spirit of the Jewish collectivity. And you simply can't replicate that in outside of Israel. And so it's increasingly difficult. I think it's a question of...
That's actually I find that a fascinating point. Something that you can't glean outside of Israel, but you might argue also something that can't be gleaned out of major Jewish centers of American life.
I agree with that.
It's very easy to preach the message of Jewish peoplehood on the Upper West Side or in Toronto. It's a lot harder to get that message across in shrinking Jewish communities in the Midwest, or even smaller Jewish communities in the South.
I agree with that. I have found, and I've argued this, that in the end, identification with Israel tends to be in proportion with identification with Judaism. And those who are more identified, more knowledgeable, more literate in Judaism, as an expression of their Judaism, tend to identify more with Israel, which is why it's so critical to be connected to the organized Jewish community. The key, from my perspective, outside the Orthodox world, the key institutions of American Jewish life in the United States is Jewish day schools, Jewish summer camps, and synagogues. And at the heart of that is the institution of the synagogue, because it defines itself as cradle to grave. And no matter how many kids go to summer camp and no matter how many kids go to a day school, most people are either going to glean their Jewish identity and their Jewish understanding of the world from synagogues or not at all. And so what we found, maybe I'll end with this because I know you want to get to questions, but we had a discussion. I had a discussion with the former consul general in New York, and he was about a program that we were launching to do outreach to Israelis, which ended up to be really very, very successful. And he was telling me that that in the Israeli consulate in New York, they tracked the immigrants from Israel from the 1948 generation. It was a very difficult time in Israel. In the 50s, it was economically depressed. And many people ended up in the United States and in New York, and the Israeli consulate tracked 3 generations of these, of the posterity of the original immigrants. And what they discovered is that essentially, there were no Jewish grandchildren of the Israelis who arrived in New York from that generation. And the reason is because in Israel, you glean your understanding of Judaism and you
the air is Jewish.
The air is Jewish.
Right.
Okay. And
takes no effort.
And if you are not, if you have no access to religion, which is the way most Jews in the West access Judaism, right, even if they're not religious, by the way.
Right.
Then, and you have nothing, if you don't even have that to hold on to, then you have nothing. And then within one generation, that is the generation of the immigrants, the people who came, they had enough in them to sustain their identity. Their kids were already Americanized in every way, except they were even less identifying with the Jewish community than their American counterparts because their parents were so unable to access religion. Mm-hmm. And then by the 3rd generation, they were gone.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking how well you would have done here in Toronto. You're speaking the language. This is why people in Toronto love you, is because you're speaking the language of Canadian Jewry, the institutions that we believe in. People say that Canadian Jewry, it's mostly a community that grew after the Shoah. And so there is still a strong memory, and that translates into supporting institutions of Jewish peoplehood, religious and non-religious, with particular intensity. And so I think your beliefs, no wonder you're so popular with my congregants. Do you want to just say a word about, we didn't mention anti-Semitism, about how anti-Semitism plays into this discussion? I know the hour is late, but I think it's important. And you mentioned it when you were talking about Farrakhan and Linda Sarsour. So you mentioned that there is an attack on Jewish peoplehood that is motivated by anti-Semitism. Can you delve into that a little bit for us?
I think it's important for us to recognize the sources of anti-Semitism, where it comes from, and what language it uses. So the anti-Semitism, the right, arguably is more pervasive. I think the Anti-Defamation League has researched this, and if I'm not mistaken, more anti-Semitic incidents come from the right than from the left. And the thing about right-wing anti-Semitism is it's very out in the open. It's not hidden under anything. They write malignant manifestos of malevolence, okay? And they're proud of it. And it's easy to recognize.
Yeah.
And every person in the mainstream condemns it. Its problem is with the Jewish people, not so much with individual Jews, because many anti-Semites never met a Jew in their life. their challenges to the Jewish people that they consider to be an insidious enemy of the white race, the Aryan nation, whatever it is. And for them, assimilation is impossible, because the Jews will always burrow into the immunity system of society and poison it and undermine it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to reject the very notion of Jewish peoplehood as alien. Okay, either we kick them out, or the solution in the 20th century was the final solution.
Right.
There was no ability to integrate. That's right-wing anti-Semitism. Left-wing anti-Semitism also has a problem with Jewish peoplehood. But it actually is prepared to embrace and welcome Jews who are willing to embrace a universalistic philosophy, who are willing to turn their backs on Jewish peoplehood as some kind of foreign, alien, distorted development of Judaism, or archaic, antique, no longer relevant.
At best, racist at worst.
Yeah. And so they're willing to accept Jews as long as they reject Jewish peoplehood in modern terms. That essentially means the state of Israel. As long as they are prepared to express their indignation at Zionism and at policies of Israel, they are embraced in the left wing. But the left wing too has a problem with this concept of the Jewish people as an entity that is capable and worthy of self-determination. And so I'm prepared to have a philosophical argument, and in some respects, I would accept philosophically, if we were to sit in a classroom or debate, with no ramifications for modern policies, I could accept that someone who defines themselves as anti-Zionist is not necessarily anti-Semitic. I could accept that on an intellectual basis. After all, there are plenty of Jews who define themselves as anti-Zionists, and you can hardly call those Jews anti-Semitic. I can accept that on one level, but this obsessive loathing of Israel as the source of all evil in the world, this holding Israel to standards that no other nation is held to, including our own nation, and the undermining of the right of Israel even to exist. Who argues with somebody who says you have no right to exist? So that all put together is an expression of the same type of discounting of the legitimacy of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish self-determination, and we call that anti-Semitism. And I would say just one additional thing, bear this in mind. In all likelihood, already now, the majority of Jews in the world live in Israel. If you count Jews who identify as Jews and are, who say, I identify as a Jew. But what's for sure is more than half of all Jewish children living in the world live in Israel. And so threats to destroy the Jewish state are threats to destroy the Jewish people. And that is anti-Semitism.
Wow. Well, I had so many, there's so much I could do with that. I wanted to talk to you about the letter from the rabbinical school students. I wanted to talk to you about all the manifestations of that kind of the pernicious side of anti-Zionism that maybe flies under the radar for many young Jews. But alas, I have taken all of your time. I hope that I had hoped that we would get to some questions, but I'm reading them here on the chat board, and These are all questions that I think Rabbi Hirsch has addressed. And plus, he invited you all to email him. I've never met a rabbi who's done that before, but he has invited you to email him liberally and critique or comment on his sermons, and I'm hoping also on what he expressed tonight. All I can say at the end of this conversation is I feel extremely grateful that your voice is as loud as it is in the both because of what technology has enabled and also because of the principle with which you speak, the moral clarity with which you speak. I think that you have been and continue to be a blessing to the Jewish people. And I know that you have a fan across the border among many, many other fans that really look to you as a source of wisdom and inspiration and I think a sense of moral clarity, as I said, in confusing and challenging times. So may God bless you with many more years of strength and vitality in the rabbinate. And thank you so much again for being generous with your time and sharing it with us this evening.
It's my pleasure. I am very happy that we had an opportunity to meet Rabbi Grover. When we're in either in Toronto or you're in New York, we have to do this in person as well.
I would love it.
And
the border opens up in a month.
And for all of you congregants, if you find your way in New York, we're on 68th Street on the off of Central Park West. So feel free and come and introduce yourselves after the service.
A great shul and a great rabbi. Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi. We'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.